I think I have. Right now.
Price is right.
I'm trying to find my dices, which is hopefully outside the room. Oh, thank you.
Did you give me one? That's yours. No, it isn't. That's what she's.
Okay.
I'm sorry. No. I think we're gonna have to order.
Okay, welcome everybody. My goodness.
Well, we can work on. Yeah.
This is great to see you. And let's see who we have on Zoom.
Lucretia's back.
I am
Yes.
back.
Where have you been?
I was on a cruise from Quebec City to Boston.
Oh my.
Which was very nice. It's good to be back.
Yes, we're glad to see you. Phyllis is there and Donna, welcome.
So,
Can you all see all of us? No. Do we introduce yourself again? Good idea. Let's just go around and introduce yourselves and so that everybody online and here can know who you are. So I'll start right here.
Barbie Ziegler.
Jan Wilford.
Rebecca Sharding,
Nancy Hobbs.
Eva Worley. Sarah Krager.
Myra Cunningham,
San Walker.
Jerry Avery,
Leanne Smith. Karen Solomon.
Diane Strymer.
Mary Alice Williams.
Well, thank you all. So
And
you want to introduce?
but you were ready, you were ready.
And you are who? ma'am?
Yes, I'll go around the aisle. That's right. Gotta name myself. Okay, well, we will have our opening prayer and I found one that I thought we could read together. It's on your agenda. Creating and loving God.
As we read your word together, may we allow it to read to us. As we enter into your story, may we understand our own stories with more clarity and wisdom. Help us to remember that you have always worked through the lives of ordinary men and women, with all their faults and failings, people like us. We bring our ordinary lives before you today. Transform our expectations so that as we study stories of the past, we may be open to your extraordinary future. Amen.
Thank you so much. And Todd,
All right,
turn it over.
all right.
He's got some for us.
Todd, I really enjoyed your doolally this morning.
Lolly.
Yeah, what? I can't remember words anymore. What is it?
Muse.
I was gonna say, I
Yeah,
like
the
that one.
muse.
Oh, like Will.
Good word though.
Yeah.
Better than do he.
It's like.
Yeah.
Mom had a friend that would put the word thingy in the sentence 3 times and mean 3 different things.
If you need it, you take it, my love.
If we had a neighbor who.
All right, well, there was one more person supposed to be here when they get here. That one, that's it.
Oh, you need Dawson.
All righty. Let's see if we can do the share screen thing. Yeah. Come on, you got this. There we go. Okay. All right, so we are in lesson 3, which is about food justice. And there are multiple passages that seems to be the theme this year, to use a whole lot of different scriptures. Some of them just a verse or two here and there, and some of them a longer story. But they're all connected and they all kind of tell the same story, so you get a different perspective, both from the author as well as the time at which some of them were written, not just Old Testament, New Testament, but even during the course of the Old Testament. So we're gonna start in exploring the text and looking at, the first one is, why is mine like that? Oh, because I have it inside out. That's good. Good Earth, the 22nd, which, chapter 1 of Genesis, which is day 4 of creation. God blessed them, that is, the man and the woman, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. So we're thinking about food justice, then obviously the plan was for there to be plenty. That's the whole concept of that part of the Genesis story. Now, when they imagined themselves to be equal to God, just a couple of chapters later in 3:19, which is what I call post-serpent and prior to expulsion. What God says to them is, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. How quickly the story turns. And then just the long and short of the last part of the book of Genesis, which is not one of the texts that we are actually reading, but it gets us to the point, because at the very end of Genesis, you have Joseph, the 11th son, who is the dream catcher. He's the one that his brothers sell him into slavery into Egypt, but he shifts from being that family outcast and a servant in Potiphar's house, who ends up being the whole manager of the house, because Potiphar recognizes how good Joseph is at what he does. But then he gets thrown in prison and interprets Pharaoh's dream that none of his seers can interpret. And he essentially becomes basically the steward for all of Egypt, which means he helps take care of it. And just a little information about the word steward. It comes from the Old English word stigweird, not weird as in strange, but W-E-A-R-D. And the word stig is the Old English word for house. I think of sticks, stig, and weird is actually the word for warden. So house warden is what a steward is, which means that you are in charge of taking care of somebody else's house to make sure nothing happens to them. Well, that's exactly what he did at Potiphar's house. But then when he gets to Pharaoh, he's steward for all of Egypt. He's the one that helps him maintain the produce for the 7 years when there's abundance. And so then when the 7 years of famine come, they're ready. They're ready to distribute to everybody, to keep everybody fed. So Genesis begins with Adam and Eve being tossed out of Eden for their failure to care for God's earth and their desire to become more godlike. But it ends with Joseph guiding Egypt toward international notoriety and influence as a power in the region. And Exodus begins with a Pharaoh who mirrors Adam and Eve, because in Exodus 1:8, it says, now a new king arose over Egypt who knew not, or who did not know Joseph. That is, a king who assumed that he was God. And so that's how the Exodus begins. But then it ends with Moses coming and the deliverance of the people. So the books go from good to bad to good to bad to good again. So there's a whole cycle of the story of God's people through that. And so the next text that we have is actually from the 16th chapter of Exodus. So this is after Moses has run off and encountered God at the burning bush and come back with Miriam and his brother Aaron, and has told Pharaoh, let my people go, and finally Pharaoh got rid of them because of the plagues, and, you know, they loaded up their jewelry and silver and took off. And so here they are in Exodus 16, and they get out there, and guess what? They're hungry. There's not anything to eat, Mom. And so they start complaining. And what does God do? In the evening, quails come up and cover the camp. And in the morning, there is a layer of this fine, frosty looking stuff they've never seen before. And when that layer of dew lifts, there's this flaky stuff on the ground that I think would probably equate to grits.
Yum.
Something
I was
like
gonna
grits.
say yum.
And, pass that around to our final guest. There's a seat over there. You're not gonna sit back there. No, no, no.
No, just say right there, one more seat, we saved it for you.
Even has a pad in it.
I would have gotten that pad if I'd seen.
You're straddling the leg, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So the dew lifts, and on the surface of the wilderness, there's a fine flaky substance, frost on the ground. And the Israelites saw it, and they said to one another, the Hebrew is manu. What is that? And that's where manna came from. It's basically the Hebrew word for what's this?
I always thought this was like those wafers we get for community.
Oh, Lord, no. Let's hope not. So they didn't know what it was, but Moses told them, he said, it's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. And he went on to say, this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs for your family. An omer, which is a measure of some sort, you know, half gallon, gallon, whatever, I don't know. According to the number of persons in your family, and provide for all of those that are in your own tents. Because remember, they're out in the wilderness and they're traveling. And they gathered, but the book of Exodus tells us that some gathered more than they needed and some gathered less. But guess what? When they measured it, those who gathered much had nothing left over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And then he gave them one more instruction. He said, don't have any leftovers. You don't have refrigerators out here. You can't have leftovers. And what did they do? They had leftovers. And so it got wormy and rotted, and Moses was not real happy about that. But eventually they figured it out, and morning by morning, they gathered as much as each needed. And then when the sun grew hot, it says it melted. Now, the end of an era and the beginning of a new era is the scripture from Joshua 5, which is basically goodbye manna and hello promised land. So it says the manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna, but they ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. So when they no longer needed the manna went away. But as long as they were in the wilderness and hungry, God provided that for them. So you're getting this idea that there's always a way for things to be provided. Now we're going to go to a couple of the Psalms. In Psalm 65, this is what I would call in these three verses, maybe a divine picture of what creation and earth is supposed to be like. It's supposed to be like, you crown the year with your bounty, your wagon tracks overflow with richness, the pastures of the wilderness overflow, the hills gird themselves with joy, the meadows clothe themselves with flocks, the valleys deck themselves with grain, they shout and sing together for joy. So it's like having a refrigerator again. Food everywhere. And then we go to Psalm 78, which in the title, which had been put in at some point in the Hebrew scriptures, it is called a maskil of Asaph. And since those aren't words that we use very often, I decided I better figure out what they mean. Asa was a Levite in the court of King David, who was both a music leader and a teacher. And he belonged to the Levites, that is the priestly line. So his job was to be one of the teachers. Psalm 78 is one of the longest psalms, which records the history of Israel from Egypt all the way to King David, according to the sources that I looked at. And what is a maskil? Well, a maskil, the Hebrew word of the root of the word is sakal, which means to have insight or to teach. So this is a teaching of the teacher to tell people what it's all about. So it is, in essence, a teaching song, because the Psalms were often sung. Even these days, they're often put to music. So even in the face of their fear and complaining, when the people complain about God not providing, God continues to provide. So God's goodness and Israel's ingratitude are listed here in the scripture. So it says, yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. He rained down on them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. Mortals ate the bread of angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he let out the south wind. He rained flesh upon them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He let them fall within their camp all around their dwellings. And they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they craved. So, a story of God fulfilling their desire to eat, even if they didn't know what it was. Psalm 105 seems to me to be sort of like the divine three-course meal. This describes food from heaven, the quail food from heaven, and then the water from the rock. Because that's the other story, when after they got the food, then they said, we don't have anything to drink. So he took the water, hit the rock with his staff, and water came out in the desert, and they all had plenty of water. We've had a few issues with water lately, and more. Right. All right, so 105 says, they asked, and he brought quails and gave them food from heaven in abundance. He opened the rock, and water gushed out. It flowed through the desert like a river. And then we go from there to Hosea in the divine courtroom, because Hosea basically speaks on behalf of God to said, people got a problem with you. And here's what Hosea says in the divine courtroom. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing and lying and murder and stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals and the birds of the air. Even the fish of the sea are perishing. And then we're not going to read the Micah passage, but you can look it up. And when you look at it, it starts off in the first verse. Verse 12 says, your wealthy are full of violence, and your inhabitants speak lies with tongues of deceit in their mouths. Well, the Hebrew actually does not, the word your is not what it has. A literal translation is whose wealthy are full of violence. So this is questioning, kind of like, again, a legal proceeding to ask somebody, whose wealthy are full of violence? Well, whose inhabitants speak lies with tongues of deceit in their mouth? Yeah. So sounds more like a witness stand, a question of accusation to say whose than to say your, but both of them are true. So, then we move to the last three scriptures, which are from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, chapter 13 of Matthew, chapter 4 of Mark, and chapter 8 of Luke. And guess what? They're all verse 8 of each one of those. I thought that was interesting. Even though they're completely different chapters, they're all verse 8. And essentially, the first two, Matthew and Mark, are identical almost. And then Luke adds a little extra. So I just put the Luke one in there. It is, of course, the parable of the sower. And Luke 8:8 says, some fell into good soil, and when it grew, it produced 100-fold. As he said this, he called out, if you have ears to hear, then hear. Use your ears. So those are most of the scriptures that were listed, but I got a couple of, we're going to go over some of the other things that are in the lesson. So we're going to stop with the scriptures there. Food justice is the whole thing. And really there's a lot about the lack of food justice in some places. And specifically, the lesson focuses on the food injustice that has been in our nation's history over the centuries. So sharecropping is the first thing that was listed, and General Sherman confiscated 400,000 acres of farmland near the end of the Civil War and gave it in 40-acre segments to the freed blacks in the South. And unfortunately, the lesson tells us that President Johnson overturned that and gave it back to its original owners. So that's how we ended up with sharecroppers, because they weren't given any property and they had to come in and work basically as tenants on the land for somebody else. And they were promised a portion of what they raised, but a good chunk of that would go to the actual landowner. So basically you're renting and working somebody else's land, and you only get a part of what you raise while you're on it. So that's how the families of freed slaves had to work for a long time. And then, of course, the Jim Crow laws, which were really aimed at creating separate and unequal places in resources in the public for trains, buses, schools, restaurants, swimming pools. So important, swimming pool. I can remember growing up, there was the white pool, and maybe if you were lucky, there was another pool, but they didn't cross the line. So those didn't end actually until the mid to late 60s when the Civil Rights Act was passed. But what I want to tell you about is everybody knows 1973 Barnesville, Georgia, right? No, sorry, that's where I was. 1973. My father was a public school educator. By then, he was superintendent of schools, and he was hired for this little town south of Macon, Georgia. So right there, almost in the center of the state. Small town, as the superintendent of the county schools. I never knew, we moved a lot, and I never knew the stories that went with them until this one. I was old enough to hear and understand what was going on. So we came to to Barnesville, Georgia, Lamar County, in, I think it was the end of 72 or 73. At the end of the school year, I came for just a little bit. And what I found out during the summer was that their high school was so old and run down that it was almost unsafe for students to be in. So they needed to build a new high school. Well, they applied to the federal government for land to build a new high school. And the federal government came down and basically looked at how they did things there in Barnesville, Georgia, and Lamar County. And they said, you're still practicing segregation. And they said, oh, no, we're not. They said, well, yeah, you are, because Lamar County had two little towns, Barnesville and even smaller Milner. And what they had done when desegregation became the law is they created a kindergarten through 12th grade school in one town for boys to go to, and a kindergarten and 12th grade school in the other town for girls to go to.
Mm.
So they were using gender segregation because the white parents did not want their daughters to go to school with black boys. And the federal government said, you can't get a dime to build a new high school until you integrate the genders. And so my dad was hired to do that so that they could get money to build a new high school. So in the summer of that year, it was made known that things were going to change in the schools. And they had riots on the square of downtown Barnesville, and it wasn't the black people. And we actually got death threats called to my house.
I bet, I was gonna ask, I bet you did.
And I remember coming downstairs one morning, and my dad was sitting in the recliner right next to the big picture window that looked all the way down the driveway. He had a pistol laying in his lap. And he was, I could tell he'd been up most of the night. And I said, Dad, what are you doing? He said, well, somebody called last night and said they were coming to set our house on fire. And I was just waiting on them to come up the driveway. I was like, whoa. So that year it happened. We went to school in the old schools for a year, with the first time with the genders ever being together. And the next year they built a high school. So for my sophomore year, I went to the new high school, and it continued on like that. But that was basically what had to be done, because they wouldn't bring it together otherwise. So the federal government said, well, this is a different form of segregation, but you're still segregated. So that was one of my early experiences of some of the laws that were tweaked a little bit in small towns, as long as they could get away with it. So now, oh no, our time's up, sorry.
No. You can't stop now.
All right, so now,
So how long did that last that you were finally able to open the school? Did you start the
so
school
we
year?
went 1 year together in the old school, and then it took them another year to build the new school.
Okay.
So the next year after that, well, yeah, because we had to do it 2 years, because you had to prove for a year, then you could get money, and then it took them a year to build it. So 2 years we were in the old schools, and then we had a new high school, and
So that became the elementary school, the old school?
they did all sorts of flipping around. They closed the old high school because it was actually the old black high school, which you could imagine how poorly that had been
Yeah.
funded and taken care of. But then, of course, the lesson mentions redlining, which is the color-coded maps that ranked perceived loan worthiness for government-insured mortgages during the 1930s. And they used red lines on the map to draw the areas that they thought weren't worthy to receive the government-supported mortgages. And miraculously, all of these areas were in neighborhoods where people of color lived. They were also denied insurance policies, health care. Sometimes supermarkets wouldn't move in, and other places that they needed for business. This didn't happen.
Who drew the lines?
Government,
The federal?
somebody,
State.
it said, yeah, it's a government assessors marked the areas that they didn't think could support the mortgage rates and be able to pay for it. So they needed to make it profitable. That's the way I understood it. And what happened was then they let the states carry some of that out. And so, especially in the southern states, they were even more harsh with it. And of course, the GI benefits bill after, in the 1940s was really not intended to discriminate against blacks, but when they allowed the states to administer that, then they created inequality of distribution of the benefits, which included things like stipends for college tuition. I know my dad went to college on he wasn't black, so he got to go. Vocational programs and more low interest mortgage rates, and even things like unemployment compensation.
I don't know how they could have done that. I can't fathom that
In a state to discriminate
against those Negro,
soldiers,
yes.
hard to imagine. And then the part, especially since we're talking about food, was the move from agriculture to agribusiness. And in essence, that is the move from, because when you think about culture, agriculture, you're talking about food for the people. But when you're talking about business, you're talking about money for the boss man,
Yeah.
Profit.
because that's what it's all about.
Money.
Yeah. So I have something to end with, and I'll tell you a little bit about the story and then I'll show it to you. In 1971, there was a movie. All of you went to see it. No, I have no idea. It was called Billy Jack,
Oh, yeah.
The Legend of Billy Jack.
Yep.
He was a war veteran who became a pacifist. Found out he had Native American roots and became a protector of wild Mustangs on an Arizona ranch, Native American reservation land. And one of the most popular songs out of that movie was 110 Soldier. Some of y'all remember hearing that. That was originally recorded in 1969 by a group called the Original Cast, which was a Canadian folk group. But the one that was actually used in the movie was sung by a group called Coven. And that's the one that became so popular. As a matter of fact, the American Radio Broadcasters Association named that song 110 Soldier. You remember how you used to have to call in the radio station to hear the song? Well, that song was the #1 requested song in 1971 when the movie came out, and again in 1973, 110 Soldier. So 2 years ago, for some reason related to something I was doing, I started hearing that song in my head and wrote some new lyrics for it. And somebody in our choir who heard it, saw the lyrics, said, "I'd like to record that." John Smith.
I was gonna say, I bet that's who it was.
So I have a recording of John. It's called Ode to Mammon. Okay, this is what I'm ending with. Stole some of the lyrics.
That's
Listen, children, to a story that was written yesterday about a kingdom made of money and the price it made us pay. In the kingdom was a treasure buried underneath a stone, and the captive people swore they'd have it for their very own. hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end. There won't be any trumpets blowing come the judgment day, on the bloody morning after one tin soldier rides away. So the captives of the system sent a message to their boss, asking for the buried treasure, sure that they were worth the cost. Came the answer from the boss man, with our servants we can't share all the secrets of the system and the riches buried there. Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end. There won't be any trumpets blowing come the judgment day, on the bloody morning after one tin soldier rides away. Now the servants cried with anger, we the workers must be paid, and they trashed the corporation, thinking that this was the way. As they stood beside the treasure in the office bloodied red, turned the stone and looked beneath it. Piss on earth was all it said. Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. You can do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end. There won't be any trumpets blowing come the judgment day, on the bloody morning after one tin soldier rides away.
Very good.
Here, John, we apologize.
The end.
That's very good. Any questions, comments, anything?
I was just gonna say, I lived in Georgia and Alabama during that era.
Mm.
Yeah. I look back today.
Are there any other Northerners or Yankees here? I was totally unaware of this problem. We went,
Gotta be kidding.
no, we went to an integrated school. I had black friends in my Girl Scout
No.
troop. And when I moved here in '76.
In the 60s, she did?
Yeah.
A very sad thing, when we lived in Georgia. We weren't rich by any means. John had started working for the government, so that wasn't great pay at that time. But I had a lady that came once a week, or every 2 weeks, I don't remember, to clean my house, babysit my children, iron my clothes, whatever I had for her to do. $2 a day. I paid her. Had I increased that in any way, I would have been ostracized from the place we lived. So I compensated her by giving her things, food and et cetera. I mean, you didn't buck the system at that point in time.
Did y'all read the book, The Help?
Yes.
Well, I grew up in Georgia, and that's the way they were treated.
That's right. I mean, it was, yeah. I came from here and we didn't have that. We did some have the problem here, yes, but nothing like when you moved to Georgia, I'll tell you.
Your movie theater was, the black people had to sit upstairs.
So did
Yeah,
the
that's why
church
we have a
balconies.
balcony.
Oh, really?
That was
Yes,
a
ma'am.
slave, yeah, a slave for the balcony.
Oh, even the bus station, they had their own room.
Mhm.
Oh, my gosh. I
That's
was
why the
just-
theaters have balconies.
Yeah, exactly, the Capitol,
Theater.
there's a balcony at the Capitol, that, and they went in through a separate door.
Well, it's very typical in many of the southeastern states to have 3 land grant universities.
Mm.
There was the 1895 federally funded school, which was for the Black population. That would be like NC, I can't think now, probably Mississippi State or something, but it would. For example, in North Carolina, there was University of North Carolina, which is now University of North Carolina at Greensboro, but it was the women's college. And the land grant money supporting the home economics type programs, family life, et cetera, went to Greensboro. The land grant money supporting agriculture went to NC State, which was the men's college. And then there was another college, which was the 1895 Black University receiving federal funding. That was very, very typical throughout the South. And when I was at UNCG, and Anna was with me, we learned, Anna Duggins, for those of you who are native Greensboro people, I mean Greenville people, we were integrated by then. But there were still these 3 schools in existence.
So what city was the black school in?
It was on the other side of Greensboro.
Okay.
In Tennessee, that's Tennessee State University.
Yes,
That was the
Historically black,
historically black,
which is where?
Nashville, that area.
in 1895, I forgot the name of the federal educational or act or whatever, but established funds to support schools that were for the Black population. It was basically agricultural based and that kind of thing. Agricultural technical.
Well, I spent the last, so we moved here, 28 years in Stafford, Virginia. And there is a church there now. It's very, very old. That has a balcony. That was where the blacks were, doesn't even have the same entrance. Has an entrance upstairs to the balcony. So totally separate churches within a church.
So they came in a different door completely from it, so they didn't engage.
Nope, they did not engage. And this is one of the old churches that there's no entrance. You open the doors and you walk down the aisle and sit down. That's it. But that's a lot of the.
Like the
small-
chapel.
Yeah, but that was the whole church, and a lot of the old churches, old churches are like that. And I grew up in the north. I grew up in Albany, Oregon, which we found out later was settled by Southerners after the Civil War as a primarily white.
Get away from it.
Yeah, to get away from it. We had one black family in the entire town. One black family. But nobody knew anything because
No,
that was just the
no.
way it was.
My hometown was very segregated, living wise,
Yeah, and well.
but we all went to the same schools.
Yeah.
We didn't go to the same churches. But
We even had 2 Presbyterian churches. One that was based northern, one was based
We did
southern.
that in the South too.
Yeah, and when they had to join, for the longest time, there was 2 Presbyterian churches and all of them that had been part of one went there and until they were forced by Presbyterian, but USA to sell one.
Mhm.
when we moved here, we heard Cumberland was the southern. We were looking at
It's,
churches.
that's a different,
It's different.
that's different, that came.
Yeah, that's a different, thing. We
Yeah.
were Northern Presbyterian here.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, that's,
No,
that's
Cumberland,
why we visited here.
If
From
I'm
what-
right, it has to
yeah,
do.
from what I
with-
understand is Cumberland said, or the Presbyterian Church said they wanted college prepared
Right.
ministers.
Seminary prepared.
Seminary,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And Cumberland said, we don't need that,
Oh,
Yeah.
so
I moved to New Smyrna Beach in
I gotta go.
71, and they had one of
But
the
you're not going out
largest
the
Ku
road.
Klux Klan
It gets bad about 5.
organizations. Anyway, they were still almost Indian people.
Well, we were first looking to move to Greeneville.
This
My
south.
brother got online and looked up a story from like 2017 in Greeneville, Tennessee, where planned pamphlets have been passed out in neighborhoods. Certain neighborhoods, I don't know.
Oh, wow.
And he said, I don't think you want to move there.
I don't even remember that.
And I said, well, sounds like
Must not have been
they
that
might
bad.
need me there.
There's also,
It's kind of getting back to food justice. My grandfather lived in western Pennsylvania, had a farm near Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And during the Depression, he had no money to pay anybody to help him bring in crops. So he had planted potatoes. You could come, he went to the station with the wagon, and they also had a car or a truck, picked up people from Pittsburgh that came up on the train and brought them out to the farm, and he paid them in potatoes. He paid them in oats. Kind of like,
That's
he
great.
paid them in manna.
Yes, exactly.
Can I say something? Don't
Exactly.
you think that all places, north, south, east,
Yeah.
west, have their prejudices?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, of course.
Of course they do.
But we're looked down in this area because of the blacks. And I think everybody, everywhere you came from,
Yeah.
you have a prejudice against someone. I really do. I
A
think
lot
it's-
of people in Greene County are prejudiced against the Hispanic population.
Oh.
Well,
because-
they are and they aren't here.
Because
I mean,
that's
I
the
know
new
so many of them
population.
now that I'm
Because they're
definitely
newer?
not,
That's
you
what-
What'd you
know.
say, Nancy?
You think it's because there's newer? That
And they
blacks
speak
have
a
always
different
been?
language.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, but when I first came, people talked bad about the Hispanics. They call them those brown people.
Really?
And it just is, yeah.
Well, in Massachusetts, they were very prejudiced against Portuguese.
See, that's what I'm
So, I
saying.
mean, it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
where you are
you
from.
gotta have
It's
somebody
just-
to hate.
Oh.
That's just sad.
Everybody needs somebody to look down on.
Yeah.
That's it, look down.
Some places it's Jews,
terrible
some
way
places, you know, I
To make
mean,
yourself feel better
It's,
by looking down
down.
on somebody.
Yeah.
Where I
That's
grew
just
up, it's
awful.
ultra orthodox
Yeah.
Jewish population, the Hasidics.
one more little area, my grandfather had fought for the Confederacy, but he farmed and had farmed in Johnson City. And, so they came through hunting land to build the VA.